Think of a wealthy suburb. What are the images that come to mind? Rows of single-family houses, cul-de-sacs, green bean casserole? What about the people? What do they look like? Do they all have a certain complexion? Why is that? The short answer is obviously racism, but the long answer is way more interesting. The most commonly cited example of the segregated suburb is Levittown, a series of suburbs made by William J. Levitt. But Levittown wasn't built until 1947. If William J. Levitt didn't invent the concept of a segregated suburb, then who did? Today, I'll tell you the story of my hometown, Chevy Chase, the suburb of Washington, D.C., not the comedian. It's a story of one of the first suburbs in the United States and how racism was baked into it from the beginning. So, hop on the streetcar. It's a long journey. Our story begins with a man named Francis G. Newlands. Newlands was born in 1846 in Mississippi. His parents were Scottish immigrants, and he spent most of his childhood in D.C. and Chicago. However, that old heritage of his birthplace stuck around with him, as throughout his life, Newlands was a Southern sympathizer. Despite his own brother serving in the Union Army, Newlands said in a letter that, quote, "The North didn't have a cause to fight for like the South." Truly a stand-up guy. In 1870, Newlands moved to San Francisco, where he was involved in a variety of real estate ventures there. However, our story begins when old Frank starts eyeing up some farmland that straddles the D.C.-Maryland border. Now at this point, Washington, D.C. was nowhere near the size it was today. It only really extended up to Calvert Street, just south of the National Zoo. However, a new technology had just arrived to D.C. that Newlands intended to take full advantage of: the streetcar. The electric streetcar was brought to D.C. in 1888, only 1 year after its introduction in Richmond, Virginia. In this new technology, Newlands found a monetary opportunity. He acquired a majority stake in his own streetcar company, the Rock Creek Railway, on June 23, 1888, only 4 days after the first streetcar company was incorporated in D.C. From there, he began the long process of laying track through hilly terrain towards his dream suburb. At the same time, Newlands was purchasing farmland all across what would become Chevy Chase. One of these farms was owned by the Belt family, which had been living here since 1725. Behind me is the site where their house likely once stood. The Belts were also the first Europeans to name the land, calling it Chevy Chase, after a legend of a battle in the Cheviot Hills in Scotland. The Belts were also wealthy slave owners, and had slaves working their land up until emancipation. In 1890, Newlands and his associates consolidated their land holdings into the Chevy Chase Land Company. By this point, they owned 1,712 acres of land throughout Montgomery County, Maryland, and D.C. This land was bought secretly and through straw buyers. This land was also quite pricey, so where did Newlands get his money? From his dead wife's will, of course. Nothing says grief like spending inheritance money on farmland. You would be forgiven for thinking this all seems a little bit scummy, because trust me, it gets 100 times worse. By the 1890s, the streetcar had been connected all the way from DuPont Circle to Chevy Chase, Maryland, to the tune of $1.5 million, or $50 million in today's money. The idea of Chevy Chase was as a wealthy suburb free from undesirable elements. It was almost entirely made up of single-family residential homes, with occasional amenities such as a country club, but absolutely no retail. That was another thing about Newlands. He despised retail. Instead, his idea was to have the family's servants go downtown to buy groceries and other necessities and bring them back up to Chevy Chase. Of course, this meant that having a servant was almost a requirement to live in Chevy Chase. And who were these servants? Don't worry about it. It'll all be explained in due course. But don't get me wrong. If you were able to live in Chevy Chase, it was a great life. The streetcar meant that what would have been a 45-minute journey on horseback was cut down to only 20 minutes. On top of this, most housing in D.C. at that time was subpar, to say the least. Services such as sanitation were poor or lacking entirely. The Chevy Chase Land Company was not only made of real estate moguls, but also of architects and engineers. Chevy Chase had a country club and even an amusement park. The problem wasn't that Chevy Chase itself was bad, but that it was a luxury reserved for a select few. Now that we've gotten the basic details about Chevy Chase out of the way, it's time to get to the beaten potatoes. Let's start with the man himself, Francis G. Newlands. Now, Francis was a businessman with a side hustle in politics. And by side hustle, I mean he was a U.S. Senator for the state of Nevada. He was elected to the House of Representatives in 1893, 3 years after starting the Chevy Chase Land Company, and was elected to the Senate in 1903, serving until his death in 1917. Newlands was a member of the Democratic Party, and was quite a big power player in the party. However, this was before the Great Party Switch, so the Democrats were the states' rights party popular in the South. Think more Woodrow Wilson instead of Zoran Mamdani. Now, on some issues, Newlands was remarkably progressive. He was an early supporter of women's rights, for instance, and also helped establish the 8-hour workday. However, when it came to race, it was a whole different story. Perhaps the most striking example of his racism was a 1909 paper he published under the name, quote, A Western View of the Race Question. Throughout the entire essay, Newlands adopts a racist tone, saying that other races threaten, quote, the strains of blood that are to mingle in our descendants' veins, the competition which our laboring men must compete, and the maintenance of our high standards of comfort and social efficiency. However, perhaps the most offensive statement Newlands makes in the paper is, quote, Blacks are a race of children requiring guidance, industrial training, and the development of self-control. Not only was Newlands racist enough to believe these views, but he also published them. Even the idea of writing an essay on the racial question is a racist one, assuming that other races are a question to be answered. He also implies a belief in eugenics through the line, the strains of blood that are to mingle in our descendants' veins. Eugenics, the pseudoscientific belief that through sterilization and legislation, a better race could be developed, was especially popular at this time. It was also strangely popular in progressive circles, due to eugenicists' belief in evolution, or their butchered version of evolution, and their push for a better future. This is also not the only time Newlands was openly racist. It gets so much worse. In 1912, in a move that, according to historian William Rowley, was viewed as extreme even for the time, Newlands advocated for repealing the 15th Amendment, the amendment granting black men the right to vote, which he called poison in the Constitution. In 1913, he also advocated for including the word white in the Constitution. So from all this information, you'd probably guess that Chevy Chase had explicitly racially restrictive covenants. However, you'd be wrong. Yes, black people could technically move into Chevy Chase, but Newlands had a trick up his sleeve to make it functionally impossible. According to a 2018 Washington Post article, during Newlands' lifetime, quote, real estate agents pushed the idea that Chevy Chase was an exclusive enclave that easily priced out non-whites, the newly immigrated, and the working class. Houses fronting on Connecticut Avenue could not cost less than $5,000, and side street residences could not cost less than $3,000. In today's money, between $90,000 and $150,000. They were likely referring to this 1916 pamphlet, published by the Chevy Chase Land Company, that said, quote, the only restrictions imposed are those which experience has proven are necessary in any residential section to maintain or increase values and protect property holders against the encroachment of undesirable elements. There were black people who moved to Chevy Chase, but they were largely servants of white families. This was in line of Newlands' views of black people as racially inferior. The insidious practice of using high housing costs to keep racial minorities out of Chevy Chase shows how even seemingly innocuous decisions can be influenced by racism, and how racism impacted every step of the design process for Chevy Chase. So far, we've only discussed exclusionary racism, keeping racial minorities out of Chevy Chase. But surely the Chevy Chase Land Company would have enough human decency to let the black people who had been living in Chevy Chase for centuries continue to live here. Surely, right? Chevy Chase was far from uninhabited when Newlands first laid his eyes upon it, It had been home to many farmers who had owned the land for centuries. While some of these farmers, like Joseph Belt, are celebrated in the community, others, like George Pointer and his descendants, are perhaps intentionally overlooked. George Pointer was born into slavery on October 11, 1773, in Frederick County, Maryland. But by 1800, he had bought his own freedom by working for the Potomac Canal Company. He was, by all accounts, a hard-working individual. In 1828, he and his granddaughter Mary Ann carried President John Quincy Adams by boat to the opening of the Chesapeake and Ohio Company Canal. According to a 2016 research paper entitled Free Black People of Washington County, D.C., George Pointer and His Descendants by Barbara Torrey and Clara Green, quote, Pointer's descendants rose from his slavery in the 18th century to become free black landowners in a northwestern corner of Washington County, and their 2-acre farm was home to 4 generations. Their property would be engulfed by the expanding suburb of Chevy Chase. In 1850, Mary Ann, George Pointer's granddaughter who accompanied John Quincy Adams on the boat, and her husband, Thomas Harris, purchased land in Broad Branch Road in modern-day Washington, D.C. This was exceptional, as only 9% of black people in Washington, D.C. owned land. Their land neighbored the Belt Plantation, now owned by Joseph's descendant, Charles R. Belt. After the Civil War, schools were opened, such as the Jesse Reno School in the new black neighborhood of Fort Reno. This allowed George Pointer's descendants, now the Harris family, to become literate. But in 1890, when Francis G. Newland started the Chevy Chase Land Company, the Harris's farm suddenly bordered an all-white suburb, which was growing fast, creating the demand for an all-white school. This is when the Chevy Chase Land Company and the district commissioners decided to destroy the community using eminent domain. But what is eminent domain? Eminent domain is the process where private land is taken for public use, such as public facilities and recreation. In 1928, 11 years after the death of Francis G. Newlands and during the tenure of his successor, Edward Stellwagen, quote, the D.C. School Board authorized the district commissioners to purchase land on Broad Branch Road for an elementary school as part of a larger plan that included buying land in Fort Reno for new junior and senior high schools for white children. All of the land purchased for these schools was located in black settlements that did not conform to the newly built suburban-style housing, and the city used eminent domain to remove property holders and raise homes. As elsewhere when eminent domain was employed to assemble property, each owner was paid something, but the payments were not necessarily generous. Those who did not want to sell were forced to leave when their homes were condemned. The Jesse Reno School was subsumed by the whites-only Alice Steele Middle School. In the Fort Reno neighborhood, all houses, quote, were leveled to make way for Woodrow Wilson, later Jackson Reed, High School in the adjacent park. And the Pointer Harris farm was demolished to make way for Lafayette Elementary School and the adjacent park. Mary Ann Moten, who owned the property at the time, was paid $6,862.50 for the property, but, quote, she had no choice in the matter. And what did the Chevy Chase Land Company have to say about all this? They were very explicit in their reasoning. In a 1931 Evening Star article, Assistant Engineer Commissioner H.L. Robb said, quote, the presence of this house, with its colored occupants, so close to a white school, is a source of possible friction that is thought desirable to remove. In 1938, only 10 years after the black land was seized, the Washington Post stated, quote, Lafayette School, once the site of barren ground, is now the hub of a thriving community life. Even though many direct witnesses were doubtless still living, the Washington Post had seemingly forgotten, or they knew and intentionally left it out. The story of the construction of the schools in Chevy Chase is an important one, yet it was one that was seldom discussed before the 2016 research paper. This could simply be forgetfulness, but it's hard to imagine that the Pointer Harris farm, let alone the massive Reno neighborhood, could be forgotten to time. This speaks to the discounting of black perspectives and experiences. I went to Lafayette myself, and I explicitly remember asking my 5th grade teacher if Lafayette was ever segregated. Her response was something like, no, because it was in the north. The use of parks and schools also reveals a lot about the thought process of the Chevy Chase Land Company. Whenever they would use eminent domain, they would always build a school and an adjacent park. They would also use eminent domain tactically in black communities to disrupt and ultimately destroy them. The practice of tearing down black communities to build parks was intentional and was not unique to Chevy Chase. A similar story played out in New York City with Seneca Village, a home for middle-class black families that was destroyed in 1857 to make way for Central Park. The intention was to expel black people through legal means. Building a school is an easy justification for seizing land, but the land owned by black people was too large for even the most sprawling school, so on top of that, they built a park. Another interesting aspect is that white land, like the Belt Plantation, gets bought, whereas black land, like the Harris Farm, gets seized. Perhaps, in line with Newlands' view of black people as mentally inferior, it made more sense for him to seize the land rather than to buy it. To modern Chevy Chase's credit, in 2021, after this history was brought to light and the murder of George Floyd brought racial justice into the spotlight, the D.C. government renamed Lafayette Park, where the Pointer Harris family had once lived, to Lafayette Pointer Park. Even though this is largely a ceremonial gesture, and most locals still call it Lafayette Park, it shows that real change is possible, if incredibly difficult. Someone at the time would likely try to justify that last example, saying, "Oh, it was simply the march of progress, turning farmland into public services." You would be ignoring the explicit racism, but when have old-timey white people ever cared about racism? However, I have no idea how you could go about justifying this next example without simply being racist. In 1906, just as Chevy Chase was starting to take off, 4 affluent businessmen attempted to make a suburb of their own, where wealthy people could live in luxury houses. However, this plan was highly controversial among their neighbors. But why? This plan sounds perfectly fine. Why would anyone protest this? Well, the 4 businessmen in question were black, and in their suburb, black people were welcome to buy. This is the story of Belmont. The 4 black men in question were Charles Cuny, Alexander Satterwhite, Michael Dumas, and James Neal. They envisioned a new type of suburb, one that was both wealthy and racially diverse. In many ways, their vision was similar to that of Newlands, except without the racial bigotry. Had they succeeded, they would have been the first to develop a wealthy black suburb anywhere in the country. In 1906, they purchased land in Montgomery County, in modern-day Friendship Heights, through a white straw buyer. This land was originally owned by our old friend, the Chevy Chase Land Company. In an advertisement in the Washington Post published on July 1st, 1906, entitled "Colored People Attention," the syndicate advertises Belmont as, quote, "the only good subdivision in Washington where colored people are welcome to buy." They also promise readers, quote, "This is your chance to buy a suburban home in the finest part of Washington." The white residents of the surrounding communities of Friendship Heights and Chevy Chase, however, did not take kindly to their new neighbors. On July 5th, 1906, just 4 days after the advertisement was published, an article in the Washington Times entitled "Belmont Colony Arouses Whites to Danger Point" was published. In direct response to the advertisement, quote, "A number of meetings have been held, and fiery denunciations of the proposed sale of Belmont lots have been indulged in freely. It is fiercely declared that the plan will not be consummated, no matter what methods are needed." It goes on to quote Friendship Heights resident Richard H. O., saying, quote, "No Negro shall ever build a house in Belmont. You may call our organization we are forming Whitecaps or Ku Klux or whatever you will. Be assured it is an effective organization and that members mean what they say." Fortunately, nothing substantial came from these threats of violence. So in that case, Belmont must still be around. Racism is only when violence happens. Not exactly. Because the Chevy Chase Land Company had a trick up their sleeve. According to a 2021 history article by Neil Flanagan and Kimberly Bender, quote, "The Chevy Chase Land Company used financing tools to stall sales until the Belmont Syndicate ran out of money. When the Belmont Syndicate bought the land, they inherited a debt obligation ruled by a legal instrument called a deed of trust. This transferred the land to a third party, in this case, a bank that had the same leadership as the Chevy Chase Land Company. They refused to release the syndicate from this debt obligation. This made the Belmont Syndicate unable to sell any new lots and caused the company to default on their debts in 1909. In later accounts of the story, the affluent black businessmen are changed to servants and agricultural workers, and the role of the Chevy Chase Land Company and local residents are deeply sanitized. This is perhaps the clearest example of racism in Chevy Chase history. The people who were sold lots at Belmont were affluent black businessmen, but the retellings couldn't comprehend this, so they made it out like they were lower class. Despite O's claim that Belmont would be, quote, a constant menace to our peace and security, the Belmont Syndicate said that they were looking for high-class and affluent people. The only reason O would say this was out of the racist belief that black people were more prone to criminality. There was no valid argument against Belmont. It was just racism. Furthermore, the threats of violence showed just how ugly the racism in Chevy Chase could be. In the newspaper article, although they worm around exactly how far they'd go, they imply through the phrase, whatever means necessary, that they'd be willing to start a race riot. Although race riots were relatively common back then, with one happening in Atlanta that same year, some believe this was a phenomenon confined to the Deep South, not border states like Maryland. This proves that this wasn't only a Southern phenomenon. Although the threats of violence never ended up materializing, the fact that they were advocating for it in a newspaper shows how close it was to happening. This also shows how seemingly race-blind instruments can be used to racist ends. There was nothing explicitly racist in the deed of trust. It was purely a financial instrument. Yet the Chevy Chase Land Company used it to swamp Belmont in debt for simply selling lots to black people. The failure of Belmont was incredibly significant because it, along with the aforementioned destruction of the Fort Reno neighborhood in Black Broad Branch, pretty much led to the racial geography we see in D.C. today. Although there are some exceptions, such as Hawkins Lane in Chevy Chase, Maryland, a series of 13 lots settled by a formerly enslaved person, in general, black people tend to live on the eastern side of D.C., particularly east of the Anacostia River and in Prince George's County, Maryland. White people, on the other hand, tend to live in the western side of the city, downtown, and in Montgomery County, Maryland. Newlands and the Chevy Chase Land Company have a large chunk of the blame for this incredible segregation. Without them, neighborhoods such as Belmont and Fort Reno would bring diversity into western D.C. and Montgomery County, and black Washingtonians wouldn't have been forced to live on the eastern side of the city. This was Newlands and his company's vision, and we're all living in the aftermath of it. I'm actually across the street from where Belmont actually was, because it's now a bougie shopping mall that didn't allow me to film. Editor's note. Do you want to know who still owns this shopping mall to this day? I kid you not, is the Chevy Chase Land Company. In 2024, the Maryland government installed this plaque honoring Belmont, across the street from where Belmont actually stood. We've already talked about how, under Newlands, housing discrimination was largely done by artificially raising property values in hopes of keeping black people away. However, as we saw with Belmont, that didn't keep wealthy black families from buying houses in Chevy Chase. It's almost like housing discrimination is really damn stupid. Hot take of the century there. But no, because in the 1920s, the Chevy Chase Land Company got a lot more overt in their tactics. They introduced racial housing covenants that forbade, quote, any person of Negro blood, as well as, quote, any person of the Semitic race from owning a house in Chevy Chase. In this housing covenant from 1919 in the Bradley Hills neighborhood in nearby Bethesda, Maryland, it explicitly states, quote, the above described property shall not be sold or transferred to any person or persons of African descent. It goes on to state that while the other rules expire 20 years after 1912, the explicitly racial one, quote, is to be perpetual. This change in attitude could have been due to increasingly racist attitudes during the 1920s, or the desire to completely remove the possibility of something like Belmont from ever happening again. Newlands and his Chevy Chase Land Company also used less overt tactics to keep black people out of Chevy Chase. One example is detailed in a 1999 Washington Post article. According to the article, in the 19th century, just as Chevy Chase was starting to take off, quote, Newlands worked with his land partner at the Chevy Chase Land Company, William Stewart, conveniently also a U.S. Senator for Nevada, to create Rock Creek Park. The developers also saw the park as buffering the white Northwest from increasingly black sections on what they called the wrong side of the park. This is another example of the Chevy Chase Land Company using seemingly innocuous tactics to carry out racist ends. A park can be thought of as a net positive for everyone. However, when the express purpose is to keep black people out of Chevy Chase, it becomes more morally dubious. On top of this, parks can be placed pretty much anywhere and are very easy to build, so it becomes a perfect tool for separating black and white neighborhoods. It also acts as a tool to take land away from black owners, as seen with the Pointer Harris farm in the Fort Reno neighborhood. The ramifications of the segregation caused by Rock Creek Park exist to this day. Although there is no census data for the neighborhoods in D.C., where the park is primarily located, there is for the communities of Maryland just at the northern tip of the park. Silver Spring, Maryland, just to the east of the park, was only 33.6% white, excluding Hispanic, as of 2024, whereas Chevy Chase, Maryland, just to the west of the park, was 74.9% white as of 2024. You can also see the effect that Rock Creek Park has on DC's racial demographics. In this map, blue represents white people and green represents black people. In the northwest corner, you can see how Rock Creek Park is still the dividing line, with Newland's racist plan still in action. So now that we've discussed the past of Chevy Chase, it's time to discuss the present. As this information has come to light in the past 30 years or so, there's been a debate on how to confront it. One of these debates was on whether to remove a plaque honoring Newlands in Chevy Chase Circle. In 2015, a group of Newlands' descendants sent a letter to the local Advisory Neighborhood Commission, or ANC, attempting a sympathetic view of their ancestor. In the letter, Newlands' descendants say, quote, "We are aware of his many notable achievements as well as his imperfections. In short, we reject and heartily disagree with his sentiments on race. However, like many other imperfect yet important historical figures of his time, he should be evaluated fairly, factually, and on the basis of his accomplishments and his faults." In the letter, they also point out that Newlands supported women's rights and trade unions, saying, quote, "Newlands was a progressive Democrat who supported women's suffrage in Nevada as early as 1913 and consistently advocated for unions and workers' rights, helping establish the 8-hour workday." They also talk about his work irrigating the West and his plans for Chevy Chase. They finish the letter with this statement, quote, "It is an unavoidable fact that many of our country's greatest historical figures held beliefs that we find repugnant today. It would be an exhausting and costly effort to rename or remove every monument and statue honoring someone who expressed sentiments or held beliefs that we now find rightly offensive, and that removing the plaque to Newlands would, quote, merely erase an important reminder of our complicated history." Given that the source is modern, Newlands' descendants are not simply ignoring his racism, instead trying to find reasons to celebrate him. While these accomplishments all speak well to Newlands' character, the monument in Chevy Chase Circle is not dedicated to Newlands the legislator or Newlands the irrigator, but rather Newlands the real estate developer. Newlands, in his capacity as real estate developer, did numerous things to keep black people out of Chevy Chase, while his support for women's rights and workers' unions were mainly done on the Senate floor. I also know it's natural to want to defend relatives from criticism and honor their legacy. However, being related to someone also often clouds our perception of them. The descendants of Newlands are also claiming that taking off the plaque would, quote, erase history. This is a popular argument used to argue for the keeping of monuments, most notably Confederate monuments, during the 21st century. However, this argument completely ignores the fact that these monuments are glorifying people, not painting them in a complex manner. The place for dealing with our complex past is somewhere like a museum, not a monument. The inscription on the fountain says that, quote, Newlands' statesmanship held true regard for the interests of all men, completely ignoring his outspoken racism. It is not a tool for reflecting on a complex history, simply a relic of a racist past. Also, Newlands was not simply following the trends of the time. He was one of the first people to create a whites-only suburb. In the words of Gary Thompson, the DC ANC who proposed the removal, quote, "I don't think Newlands gets a pass because of the times. He helped create the times." A common counter-argument I get is, while Chevy Chase has a racist past, Chevy Chase is no longer racist. I agree with this somewhat. Chevy Chase is not racist in the traditional sense of the word. The days of openly racist people in Chevy Chase, besides the select few, Brett Kavanaugh, are far behind us. However, actions often speak louder than words. While there are no people doing overtly racist actions in Chevy Chase, there are plenty of people doing ignorant and classist ones. This brings us to the concept of NIMBYism. A recent controversy in Chevy Chase has been the planned redevelopment of the Chevy Chase Community Center. In 2023, the DC government announced that it plans to redevelop the center, which was built in 1971 and honestly looks like it hasn't been touched since then. In some sections of DC, this news was received positively. Carl Lenkowski of historic Chevy Chase, DC said, quote, "We want to make the statement that we are a welcoming community and showing it by demonstratively making it possible for people to live among us." However, many people did not take this news positively. A large number of complaints were based on the idea that the local government was giving land to developers to build affordable housing, which they saw as giving public land to private interests. According to a petition filed by Chevy Chase Voice, quote, "In surplusing public land, the city sells that property to developers at a steep discount or leases it to them for $1 a year. The promise of some affordable housing is a fig leaf for a lucrative privatization deal." They also complained about the loss of green space. However, in the same paragraph, they also complained about high-rise buildings inappropriate for our neighborhood. The phrase inappropriate for our neighborhood is a phrase commonly associated with NIMBYism. NIMBYism, which stands for Not in My Backyard, has a long history in Chevy Chase and the surrounding area. In fact, the Wikipedia page for NIMBYism includes a photo of a radio tower in Tenleytown that was forced to be demolished after residents said that it would ruin the feel of the neighborhood. NIMBY arguments are on display throughout the entire community center debate. One local resident said that the community center would be, quote, "a big wall in front of my porch," and that Chevy Chase was, quote, "not the correct site to jam this housing." NIMBYism and the argument of preserving the neighborhood feel can be anti-racist when used against efforts such as gentrification. However, in a neighborhood like Chevy Chase that has always been incredibly white, such moves often translate to racist results. When they are resisting change in a historically segregated neighborhood, they are effectively shutting the door to black and low-income residents. Also, in order for a city to function, they must have services such as affordable housing. If a resident protests affordable housing and other services that ruin the feel of the neighborhood, these services still must go somewhere, ultimately to low-income neighborhoods that don't have the green space to give up. Also, this is going to veer heavily into opinion territory, but do you actually want to see the remodeled version of the community center? Given all the uproar, you're probably expecting it to be the ugliest thing you've ever seen, but if you actually look at it, it actually looks pretty nice. Look at all that green space. Yes, there's technically less of it in terms of square footage, but it certainly looks a lot more green. Also, speaking from experience, the Chevy Chase Community Center is rarely ever utilized. The library is used more, but its architecture is so unappealing that I only remember going in there on one occasion. You can imagine how a remodeled community center would be home to way much more community life than whatever this aged cube is. People only started caring about the community center when the government decided to do something about it. Chevy Chase is also incredibly behind on affordable housing. The area of Rock Creek West, which consists of all of DC west of the Rock Creek Park, including Chevy Chase, only built 230 units of affordable housing, the lowest in sheer numbers out of all of the area. This was also only 11.6% of the target, which was the lowest out of any of these areas. They had the highest target for affordable housing, but built the smallest number. Needless to say, affordable housing is incredibly needed in Chevy Chase and the surrounding area. The fervent protests against affordable housing also allude all the way back to Belmont. Although the overt racism and threats to violence are obviously gone, the complaint about the destruction of the community remains the same. O's claim that Belmont would, quote, "destroy the happiness of our homes" is quite similar to Chevy Chase's Voice argument that the construction project would be inappropriate for our neighborhood. Even though the violence is gone, the intention remains the same, to resist change in the community. So, we finally reached our conclusion for this video. If I had more time, which I unfortunately do not, I would talk about the modern examples of racism in Chevy Chase, such as the 2020 controversy where black students were forced by their peers to act out the roles of enslaved people. Yes, this is the same Lafayette Elementary School that was built on the Pointer Harris farm, and it's the same Lafayette Elementary School that I went to. It's a great school, besides the obvious. Now, what is my perspective on this history? As someone who's lived in Chevy Chase my entire life and will soon leave it all behind to go to college. In one word, mixed. In many ways, Chevy Chase is a lovely neighborhood. It's beautiful, the public schools are the best in the city, and Connecticut Avenue is nice and quaint. When I leave here for college, I'll probably miss it more than words can imagine. I know in this piece I can come off as bashing Chevy Chase a little, but in reality, my opinions are far from that. I only bash it out of a place of love. I would be remiss, however, to not mention the negative aspects of living in Chevy Chase, because no matter how pretty it is, how clean the streets are, and how good the schools are, it will never replace the genuine experience you get from a more diverse community. Growing up, I have to say that I was incredibly isolated from the world around me. Sure, we learned in school about the civil rights movement and how racism is wrong, but you can only teach so much about acceptance without genuine diversity. Going into the wider DC community, I was wholly unprepared, and I'm ashamed to admit it caused a lot of tension. This is the direct result of what happens when you aren't exposed to diverse perspectives from a young age. Segregation doesn't only hurt those discriminated against. So what can we do? Quite a lot of things. I would implore anyone living in Chevy Chase to support the remodeling of the Chevy Chase Community Center. It seems like, as of earlier this year, it was given the full go-ahead, as a team was picked to redevelop it, but the fight is never over. Also, we should all educate ourselves and others about this important history, so we are aware of how this community was built and how it impacts everyone, both in and outside of this community. Obviously, no one alone can solve racism, but we can try to stop it from rearing its ugly head in our communities. Moving back to the topic of Francis G. Newlands, no person in history is ever fully good or evil, including Chevy Chase's infamous founder. Newlands was a savvy businessman that, through his prediction of the usefulness of the streetcar, was successful in building one of the most prosperous suburbs in America. However, his immense racism that influenced every aspect of his model suburb impedes anyone's ability to celebrate him in good faith. Perhaps somewhere he deserves to be celebrated, but that place is not the community he fought so hard to keep segregated. Thank you so much for watching this video to its conclusion. I hope you enjoyed it just as much as I enjoyed making it. This video took me 2 months to make, so your support would mean the world. Please consider subscribing to this YouTube channel to see more content like this in the future. If I got something wrong, please feel free to correct me in the comments. I tried my best to give information that is as accurate as possible, but it's entirely possible that I made mistakes. I apologize if my voice is a bit inconsistent throughout the video. I was in the middle of voice training while I was filming. I also apologize for any words I mispronounced or any lines I flubbed. I was working on a tight schedule. This project was done as a senior capstone. I adapted this script from my final research paper from my 11th grade history class. I'd like to thank my 2 teacher mentors, Jacqueline and Tim, as well as the founder of the Chevy Chase Historical Society, Mary Ann Toohey, who I had the pleasure of interviewing. I'd also like to thank the Chevy Chase Historical Society as a whole for their help, and their newsletter article on the video. Most of all, I'd like to thank you for watching.